morning, everyone online and attending. We are really happy to see you all. And I think, as was indicated, this is almost like an emergency meeting. It's, following obviously an incident that, in a sense, here at the university really happened at our doorstep, just a stone throw away, literally from where we are as a Center for Human Rights. So I commend the unit expression, information and digital rights unit within the center for bringing together the partners and thanking very much the partners. I think all of them will be represented in the list of the speakers. We thank you for collaborating at such short notice, and Department of Justice also as a partner in this, we really appreciate. I just want to say a few words. I think, we as South Africans, obviously we pride ourselves in having a very progressive, a very solid constitution. And on an occasion like today, I'm reminded of the basics of the constitution. Article 7(2), the obligation on the government in the constitution to protect the rights of our citizens, of ourselves, of the people in the country. Respect, protect, promote, and fulfill. And it is the obligation to protect, I think, that comes into play, right? It's when non-state actors violate the rights of other people in our courts and in our country's jurisdiction that we are concerned, and we look to the state to see how has the state, come into play into this environment, into this domain. Yes, the state in the first place has the obligation to respect, but how does it really protect the rights, right? That very intricate and difficult function, I think, comes into play in this incident that we saw happening at Zanzou, right? So then it takes me to Article 8(2) that says the Bill of Rights in our wonderful constitution binds, it says, it binds not only the state, but also natural persons, all non-state actors, private entities, bars, restaurants, nightclubs, right? It binds them. They are bound under the Bill of Rights, but it says to the extent that is applicable. And that applicability depends on the nature of the right and the nature of the duty imposed by the right. So we are saying that the Constitution is not only vertically applicable between the state and the individuals, but also horizontally applicable. And I think today's discussion, in a sense, will dissect that horizontal obligation, among other things, right? What does it mean that the Constitution applies in the relationship between all of us? It's a private entity and private individuals who come there. The state has to hover somehow on top of all that, but it is about private individuals. The Constitution may set out these values, but those values had to be translated into domestic legislation and domestic action and awareness raising and actual accountability, right? So I think I'm really looking forward. I thank everyone who's attending, everyone who's making their presentations in this kind of workshop, almost think tank environment, right? That we want to think through and come to grips with what happened and really how to respond from a human rights point of view in the context of the Constitution, but also looking at this intricacy of horizontal and vertical applicability of our Constitution. So thank you, Belinda, for your role here. Thanks again to everyone for being here. We really look forward to your contributions, making this a very rich discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Over to you, Advocate Said.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and good morning to you and to all those who are online today. Again, I want to say as well, thank you for convening this meeting. It's a pity about the circumstances, so I align myself with the comments of my former professor, Frans Viljoen, and as he was going through the constitutional provisions for a second there, I thought I was back in class again. He always had this way of simplifying and demystifying these very important, but also very majestic principles of the Constitution that elicit a whole lot of rights, responsibilities, and obligations. I certainly think, and I like the fact that this is a webinar that is more of a think tank session, because I think this matter has really brought to the fore what are the systems and processes and frameworks that we have in place, and also how do we engage in a different way with the business community, especially with where this has happened, especially as Prof. Viljoen has said, it's on our doorstep, and it means it can happen to any one of us, as it did to these unfortunate group of men. Now, I want to also, and I'm sure speakers are going to pick on and engage with the issues of torture. I think your concept note has articulated that quite crisply. The issues of torture, the inhuman degrading, because that's really what it was. And that principle comes and what informs our constitutional values as well, the issues of inhuman, degrading treatment, punishment, and what we saw was really torture. So in as much as these young men might have had undertaken, what's the word, committed certain acts of criminality, the proportionality to what they received is not even the question. The first part is it's a crime, and so they should have literally engaged with the authorities to respond to that crime. But this is where it really now takes a different course as to the nature of the response to them, the fact that they acted with impunity, they acted outside of the law. And I think that's where we really need to now set the tone for the meeting as to, and this was the question, what is the role of the Department of Justice? But before I go to that, I also wanted to anchor two very important principles in our Constitution that I think we've got to have sight of. The first one is, and it was quite significant to our constitutional system, constitutional democracy, given what we as a country went through with regard to torture and acts of inhumanity, degrading treatment. I mean, the apartheid system was pretty much designed on that premise. And it's why it's also one of the first instruments, that is the Convention Against Torture, Cruel, Inhuman, Degrading Treatment and Punishment, was one of the first instruments that was ratified by the South African government because of our historical past. And the first case that came up at the Constitutional Court was that of State versus Makwanyane. And in that case, which dealt with the capital punishment, the principle of dignity and worth was what was really emphasized. And that was the reason why that case was chosen, because it was really wanted to anchor and amplify the principles of dignity and worth. And so when we look at our own constitution in Article Section 1, it says the Republic of South Africa is one sovereign democratic state founded on the following values, and human dignity is the first and foremost. So it's a Section 1, and it's A, where human dignity is, simply because the idea was that we would instill this value and build this culture of human rights within the context of respecting our worth as a human being and dignity. And then, of course, it goes on to use the terms where racism was the term. It turns it a discussion today. And then if you go to Article 10, Article 10 again speaks to everyone has inherent dignity and the right to have their dignity respected and protected. So I think as we anchor this conversation, that is the pivotal point that I wanted us to raise. And as we go into building this culture of human rights, that's always at the base. Now, I think, and before I come to 2 or 3 of my suggestions, because I know you've given me 5 minutes only, I won't get into the principles of the convention. And certainly, I think when we do our report on the Convention Against Torture, this incident is certainly going to be one of those that the committee will ask us about, and what mechanisms and measures we've put in place. So I think in that sense, Professor Fulyun's points are already assisting us to see how what we've put in place so that we don't have this incident happening. Now, as we speak about the issues of dignity, worth, the respect for us and being treated in a particular way, we've got to look at where we've come from again, from a country that had this kind of torture, the kinds of treatment where it really eroded who we are. And I think part of this conversation has to look at the legal system. It has to look at the systems and processes. It's got to also look at our national psyche from a perspective of psychological trauma, both for those who were affected in this and also those perpetrators, as I'd like to call them, and also how we are responding as a society. So I think there is that component of it where it's very important to reflect on that. And within the context of the legislation and systems in place, I think we've got a strong, and your concept note speaks to this. It's a country that has a very strong constitution, and I think the area that we need to reflect on 30 years later, and that was the conference that was alluded to, is that in 30 years we've done incredibly well to put a constitutional principle, a framework in place, to put in as many legislative processes and systems in place. We have, as an example, a series of acts, and I'll come to the Whistleblowing Act, which then speaks to the horizontal application, but to some degree, but it really speaks to a strong system. Where the gap is, and this is what we will intensify as the department. So it's not really an advert for us at all, by no means, but through that conference, what we've realized, and I think one didn't need a conference necessarily, but we needed the evidence which it displayed, in that we have done well with the legislative processes and systems, but building the culture of rights still is something that we haven't done as well. In fact, we've done series of workshops on human rights awareness together with NGOs, CBOs, but still we haven't unpacked the principles of the Constitution, where all of us know how to protect and how to defend our rights. And what you saw in this incident is people who committed an offense were already accepting this kind of treatment. And of course, we all don't know the circumstances. They could have been, and it seemed like they were in a position where they couldn't necessarily get out, but eventually they weren't able to come forth, perhaps because they weren't comfortable with doing so, or they just didn't know how to protect themselves because they probably saw it as a situation of, we did commit an offense. I mean, who knows? There's so many ramifications of that. But I think for us, it's not so much whether they could or they didn't, but how strong are we in understanding how to defend and protect those rights? So whilst the state has those responsibilities to put the systems in place, they are certainly there. Another area I would go to is, and incidentally, since this incident, we've obviously shared our positions on radio and media. I personally have received a lot of complainants messaging me privately on social media to say, this also happened to me, what do I do? And that's a good segue for me. I mean, on one hand, it's the first message that came through really, kind of shakes you and gets your blood cold, because you're like, oh my God, there's so many more that we don't know about. But on the other hand, it was also, in some ways, encouraging that people wanted to come through and didn't quite know how to. And that was the query, help me, what do I do? And that's the segue to one of the institutions that we have. And in this regard, a recommendation I would, even though it's not in my place to do so as a Department of Justice, but an investigation by a Chapter 9 institution like the Human Rights Commission. And I think this is one of those investigations that have to take place together with perhaps the Commission for Gender Equality, because if this is one incident that came out, women in our country generally are far more vulnerable. I'm not saying that the one is worse than the other, but I certainly think there's so many other manifestations of one not feeling safe in society today. So that would be one aspect where, and I'll go back to the constitutional literacy aspect, but an aspect where we could say, this is an investigation that needs to take place. Certainly the Commission has already, through their provincial offices, because I reached out to them immediately, and they've indicated that they will be managing the complaints. But perhaps once the complaints come, an investigation is something to take forward. And, you know, I've found that these reports from these Chapter 9s are very useful. And again, your webinar, as an example, is very useful, because those of us who are administrators in government don't always have the time to be in these things, or not to be in the think tanks, to be part of these think tanks or set them up ourselves, even though we do so at times. But it really helps us. So again, another thank you to you for just consolidating the discussions, and even, you know, with what might come out of an investigation from the complainants, gives us a roadmap to understand where else it's happening. Now, once there are systems and processes in place and legislation, the issue is how often do we use it, and do we know how to use it? And I think that's an area which the seminar will come up with some ideas of how much more awareness do we need to raise around this. And as I said, one thing that, and this came through in the SONA recently, where the president announced the medium-term development framework, where we'll intensify constitutional and human rights literacy, because whilst many know that there's a constitution, the issue now for us as we go into the next decade of human rights is, how do we improve our knowledge, understanding of defending and protecting those rights, and also that administrative aspect, which is also that accountability. If I don't, as an example, and as I was asked on many of the radio stations, if the police don't respond, what do I do? We can't be disempowered. There are systems to respond to that if there isn't that accountability that's managed. So that obligation to protect is very necessary. But this is where it comes to two other points, and I will end on those 2-3 points, which is our participatory democracy. What does that mean? So what does defend and protect mean in the Constitution? And then as we as citizens, because I think we've got to applaud the, maybe that's not the right term in this context, but to be, for the complainant, the person who shared the video, in as much as there were, you know, questions were, there's a, you know, invasion of popular rights, and my question then was, well, who was sharing it? What was the context? Was it the business? So that's a whole nother seminar to discuss that component. But the issue is, when we speak about us coming forward and the collective responsibility, it unpacks that principle of our Constitution, which is where we participate in our democracy. And at this point in time, what we're seeing is, what is government doing about it? And this was an example of somebody who came forth, and suddenly so many others are coming forward to say, this is what's happened across. So I think participatory democracy doesn't only mean NGOs going to parliament and responding to policy matters, but how do we ensure that our local police station, our community where this has happened, is empowered to be able to challenge when systems are not working. And as government, we can't always be in every, know every incident that's happening. But when incidents do happen, what is our rate of response and how are we held accountable for that? So I think that's where a participatory democracy is very necessary, and that's where the empowerment and the knowledge base on human rights, constitutional literacy, and also just knowing our system of how to engage with whichever part of the criminal justice, but also encouraging those around us to report when there are such incidences, because this democracy cannot only succeed because of government. Government is one of the many stakeholders, of course, the largest with the resources, and creates that enabling environment. But it requires for all of us to come through. And I think this is partly what we are doing through your seminar as well. Now, the other component that I want to go through, which I haven't really touched, is our national psyche. And again, here it goes to, which we tend to not acknowledge as much, being a country that has gone through so much trauma. And 30 years later, I'm always, I think all of us are told, and I never want to, in any way minimize our constitutional framework. As 30 years later, do we still need to say that we're still suffering from the effects? I mean, when you look at this kind of episode, when you look at the episodes that we're having of young children who maybe not had, those of us who are sort of beyond the 30-year period, sort of in our 50s, where what we didn't anticipate, I certainly didn't anticipate, perhaps naively, the young children in schools today would behave in a way that still speaks to the disrespect for tolerance. So it means we're still, because the ideas come from someone, because you're not innately born to be racist, you're not innately born to be torturing someone. There's something seriously wrong with one's psyche. And I think at a national level, we haven't quite addressed that sufficiently. And when we do, and I think that's something we need to look at, and I hope your discussion further will speak to that in many ways. And we've seen in many instances where we've done collective psychological support for communities, not always individually. I think another incident is also what happened in the July unrest as an example of how everyone began to react. So I think that's speaking to how we behave and how the disproportionate responses that are meted with whatever incident. Now I'm going to conclude, because I think I'm beyond my 5 minutes and you're incredibly polite, but I will conclude on these last 2 points that I raised a little bit earlier, which is the issue of the whistleblowing, the Protected Disclosures Act. Now, of course, the person who released this footage is an employee, and the support system that there is. And if the Protected Disclosures Act was amended to include businesses. So it's also not just the government, but it's also private sector. And you might say, yes, but that's only looking at businesses and government. What about the individuals that were there? And this brings me to then the point on firstly just the protected disclosures, where we're not necessarily seeing it beyond just fraud and corruption, but if the preamble and the spirit of the Protected Disclosures Act speaks to anything that's untoward, wherever there's an injustice, and that would include this kind of behavior from that perspective. And I think that is an act that we need to look at in terms of how do we support people in these environments who all might have seen this but were just too scared to speak. So I think that in itself is another seminar discussion. But I want to come and end on this last point. I know I didn't deal with all of the points as much as I wanted to, but this one is looking at business and human rights. Now, when we speak about business and human rights, we usually speak about it. And I think the stereotypes, and I'm not being disrespectful to that body of work, we speak about it from the perspective of the Global Compact. We speak about it from big business and multinationals, because so far the whole trajectory commenced on the backdrop of extractive industries and especially indigenous peoples around the world, especially in the Latin Americas and Africa and down under, where people had lost so much and were forcibly removed in ways that they weren't compensated, violent. We know of many chiefs in those regions that were killed, lost their lives, tortured, etc. So we tend to see business and human rights in that context. This situation has now asked us to bring an angle into it where we looked at ethics, corporate governance, but also outside of the bigger companies. In South Africa, we've got a multi-model type of business environment. And you and I both know, and this not only includes torture in a nightclub, but you and I both know, when we did a study recently, and not recently, a while ago, domestic workers in the homes, the kind of torture which we know still happens. But it's looking at, and I think this is an opportunity for us to now rethink business and human rights for the South African context. And if we bring light to what businesses may be doing, whether it's the sweatshop environment that we have in the country, whether it's nightclubs, and we might want to confine it to nightclubs for now, but it really brings a spotlight onto businesses and how they are engaging with their employees. And it also is our then responsibility, where we know of these types of businesses, to then also not necessarily patronize such businesses. And it could also be an incentive to put, which you will see through the Global Compact on Business and Human Rights as an example. There are always awards for businesses that have ethical practices. So incentives like that, where you put a plaque outside to say this is the motto that we fit in, because I think businesses, because they're not so regulated in the sense of being observed and monitored, are tending to behave in this manner with such kinds of impunity. So I just wanted to bring, raise this, and perhaps it's where we have, and we will also look at this, whether it's in collaboration with you or others, that we have got to rethink what business in this environment outside of what we see in IOTSA, which is the Directors Institute of Corporate Social Investments and Corporate Social Responsibility. But how do we look at medium, smaller businesses and the kind of practices that are not acceptable in this culture of human rights? Because it's our collective responsibility for us to build this culture of human rights. So thank you. And again, I look forward to the discussions, unfortunately, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak almost immediately, because unfortunately cannot stay through the entire session, but I certainly have colleagues from the department who has joined the webinar, so will give us some feedback, though I will stay for a short time. So thank you and all the best, and look forward to the outcomes of this discussion.
Thank you so much, Deputy Director Said, for that beautiful insights in what happened. And you did touch on very important aspects. Before we open the floor to questions, we're just going to have the speakers go through their short presentations or their speeches, and then we'll open it up as a conversation to everybody else. So the following speaker who is going to speak is Miss Noma Masiko Mpaka. Let me just check if she's in.
Yes, I am.
Yes. Okay. All right. So you're going to be our second speaker.
Thank you so much, Belinda, and thank you also to the previous speakers. I'm so thrilled that, I think I actually can speak. I think the time that DDG took, I will give some of my time to her, because she said a lot of what I wanted to say. I'm glad that she touched on, the historical context of South Africa, because we found ourselves where we are as a country when it comes to issues of torture and violence, I think generally because of the history, of course. And I'm glad also that Prof spoke about, the values of the Constitution being translated into our laws and actions, because I think really the issue in South Africa when it comes to human rights is this gap that exists between what's written in policy and just a really good legislative environment, but then how that does not really speak to the realities on the ground. And of course, the gender dimension, really thrilled that was mentioned as well. That this may be really just the tip of the iceberg, because if you have, young men who are violated in such a way, we know that the vulnerability of young women, of course, we know the history of women being spiked in clubs, the allegations of drug rings and human trafficking being operational in clubs, and just generally the sense of insecurity in such spaces has been documented. And I think now we're beginning to have the conversation that maybe we should have had a long time ago. What I wanted to talk about, much of it has been said, but I think the one thing for sure is that, this is not an isolated incident. And I think one of the things, one of my submissions is the issue really of compliance and safety in such establishments, and the need really for long-term measures and mechanisms to ensure safety for all people in such establishments, especially for young people. We know of the incident that took place back in 2022 in June in East London, the Enyobeni Tavern, where over 20, many of them underage children, died in the tavern. So really, I think, and of course, issues around compliance, how did they get in the first place? How, was alcohol served to such young people, etc. And I think, so the issue really, I think for me, the submission is around compliance. And I think that's where, PSIRA comes in, the Private Security Industry Regulatory Authority. And this is the statutory body that regulates the private security industry in South Africa. We know that in a statement, the regulator said that they have now launched an investigation to determine whether the security officers involved in this incident were actually registered with PSIRA. But interestingly, so I'm not quite sure if that has been determined yet. But what I saw as well last night is that the one suspect who was actually arrested, the Congolese national, that he actually had, priors previously of theft and other issues. So I think the issue of compliance and the role that the regulatory body should be playing, and the role that the employer, so Zanzou in this context, that they're employing security officers, bouncers who are registered with PSIRA, who don't have prior convictions or issues like that. So I think the issue around compliance is one that needs to really be addressed. The other one that I want to touch on really is around the psychological impacts, which are really profound. And again, this speaks to, what DDG spoke about when it comes to kind of the psyche. And I think that's where, your Department of Health, Social Development, and other CSOs, and I'm glad CSVR is in the room as well, who actually do provide direct services to victims of violence. So I think when we're thinking about, the fact that these are young men, they have their future ahead of them. They have been violated, and this violation has been documented. Not only is it documented, it's also circulating on social media. So thousands and hundreds and thousands and possibly millions of people have viewed their violation, their most intimate parts of themselves being exposed. And I can't imagine, how difficult it must be for them to return to school. Many of them are, in university, to face the world again, when their nakedness and has been shown to the world. So I think for me, it would be, the other submission would be around kind of the psychosocial support that is provided to these young men. And I think then lastly really is around really the gender dimensions that, we have touched on as well. We know this is not an isolated incident. So I think there's lots that needs to be done in terms of ensuring that these kind of spaces are safe. Somebody mentioned, in another webinar, or rather another discussion around kind of young people, students in particular, needing sort of an outlet. They're studying, etc. They're needing an outlet to socialize. And I think there was a discussion around whether clubs are that kind of platform. And I don't want to bring that discussion I don't want to get into that discussion effectively, but I want to have a more, to kind of have a conversation around sort of alternative sort of outlets for young people. And somebody made reference to a university in the Western Cape that has a clubhouse. I think it was the University of the Western Cape that has a clubhouse where safety and security can be, sort of better regulated within the university for their students. But at the same time, I think young people have free will. They can go where they want to, and we need to ensure that they are safe within those spaces. Yeah, I think I think I'll leave it there. I also do need to dash at some point. But thank you so much for the conversation and for allowing us to have this space.
Thank you, Noma, for your time, and I hope you're going to be able to stay for at least 1 or 2 questions before you dash out. Our following guest speaker is going to be Lwazi, Mr. Lwazi.
Thank you so much, Belinda, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's so difficult speaking after such articulate and smart speakers because now all you have to do is repetition. But I would like to touch on a point that has not been really touched on, especially in the analysis of the situation. And it naturally links to the national psyche that was raised by Dr. Shireen Said. And that's part and parcel of the post-apartheid and post-colonial masculinity that is derived within South Africa. What has happened during the apartheid period, especially concerning male masculinity, is a hyper-masculinization and a hyper-militarization of that masculinity. And that feeds on to other social issues. Issues around gender-based violence, issues around men themselves not being open enough to report such incidences due to the feelings of embarrassment, and even to situations and how police themselves treat such cases. As there's a lot of shame that is added towards those who report such cases. And there's a lot of shame towards those who embark upon utilizing the various frameworks that have been mentioned earlier on. And therefore, what we need to do is start unpacking the type of masculinity in a post-democratic society that we need to require that will leverage upon these instruments that the government and the state actors have implemented. And then how do we now drive those forward in order for us to create a new masculinity that is not afraid to utilize these various frameworks, that is not ashamed of protecting their right to dignity, that is not afraid for themselves to ventilate systemic injustices, but not in a violent manner. What we've always seen in nightclubs in this situation, myself being a former student myself, is that these violent incidences, which used to be left there, either they turn into battery and assault cases, or they turn into murder or attempted murder cases. And we have seen this throughout the higher education and training sector, and we've seen it in nightclubs throughout the entire country. But what is much more startling within this case is the ability to video and record these cases. Now, this creates a situation where there are thousands and thousands of other cases that get ignored on the basis that they were not recorded. But now, how do we now foster a situation where such cases are reported and the police actually treat them seriously? And that will require a proper national dialogue, and hopefully President Cyril Ramaphosa, within the broader national dialogue that the national government is planning going forward, we introduce a concept of how do we now defining future masculinities for South Africa, future manhood. Because a lot of the sources, if you look at the criminal statistics released by Minister Zanzou, a lot of the violent sources of the criminal activities, from rape to murder to assault to other various forms of physical contact crimes such as robbery, etc., etc. The majority of these incidences are conducted by men within our society, so it clearly means that we have a men issue within our society. And therefore, we need to deliberate and strategically target how do we now unpack that social psyche that is now leading towards this form of masculinity. The second issue is that the state of bureaucracy, even though we have these various legislative frameworks, etc., issues such as Zanzou, which we now recently discovered that is not properly zoned, the lack of enforcement by health and safety individuals, how municipalities now have to play a role in the enforcement mechanism, especially when one has the metro police as a means of enforcing bylaws and general national law. All these various enforcement mechanisms, they need to be coordinated with with a new mentality, because currently what has happened is that there's a tendency within law enforcement and general enforcement, not only the corruption aspects of it, but also social attitudes of the individual officials when targeting these individual cases. Because these cases are not very new, they're not from 2025. The cases happened in 2022 and 2023. And therefore, there needs to be a situation where we have a platform where we start to unpack and deconstruct the type of masculinity that also obviously we need to feed onto the basic education system in the higher education sector. And in that national dialogue, then we can find our way forward. And there have been a lot of media assertions, especially concerning the nationality of these individuals that are alleged to have committed these crimes, and a lot of commentary itself has tended toward being towards highly xenophobic in its approach. We need to push back against such narratives, and as it pains a lot of foreign nationals who are doing a good, decent job, paying their taxes and trying to build a new future within South Africa. And under the same brush. And therefore, we should be very conscious in even when people are articulating narratives about whether the nationality of the individuals. We should treat individual cases as crimes, whether or not the individual comes from whatever country they may come from, in order for us to prevent further sparks of future anti-migrant sentiments that might persist within South Africa. And I think I've covered my 5 minutes. Thank you, Belinda. Over to you.
Thank you, Lazi. You were right on time. Our next speaker is going to be Miss Mary.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well today. So I think the previous three speakers have actually covered a lot, where even Norma had to talk about, obviously, the mental health, of the people, that they were tortured and all of that. But I think one thing I would like to really mention is that I think what happened, the incident is still unknown. We're not sure what exactly happened. Some say, or the club had actually said that the guys had stolen phones, and then some others had said that because they didn't pay their bills. But I think right now, whatever happened doesn't really matter. I want to just look at also some of the legal violations and the human rights protections. So some of some of what had happened to them, looking at even the news and the gory images on Twitter and all of that, were assault, GBH, with the intent to actually cause grievous bodily harm. Some of them were, I would say, kidnapping, because they were held for long hours, without being let out, sexual assault, torture, and obviously the contravention of the Poppy Act, where they actually displayed the faces and the body of these people, and it's all over Twitter. It's sad. It's really now with the Twitter laws that, where there's just information everywhere and there's not blood and everything, and it's really gory, right? And so for me, I would say that the major questions that begs for answers is, for example, who is responsible for protecting human rights or human dignity in public spaces? Because some people will just go about their way and say it's not my business, right? And again, some of the other speakers have actually mentioned some of the legal frameworks that actually exist to protect or prevent such abuses. And how do we hold these perpetrators accountable? Because it's one thing, like some of the previous speaker had said, that these things keep happening again. It's not a 2025 event, but then the question is, why does it keep happening, right? And so again, the first would be the right to dignity and respect. Articles 1 and 5 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, actually affirms that all people are free and equal in dignity and rights, and all, and nobody should be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. We have Article 5 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, that says that every individual should have the right to the respect of dignity, as because of the fact that they are a human being, and recognition of the legal status. So it doesn't matter what they have done. There's no excuse. And the funny thing about it is that when it comes to torture is one of those exclusive rights that it has no limitations. You can't say, oh, because one thing happens, or there's no limitation according, when it comes to torture or dignity. Article 6 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights says that every individual shall be entitled to their personal liberty and the protection of the law. Even Section 10 of the South African Constitution actually guarantees that everyone has the right to have their dignity respected and protected, and everyone has inherent dignity as a human being. And so basically the actions that have happened, they just a blatant disregard for all of these principles. And then I would say the second would be the freedom from torture and inhumane degrading treatment. So you have Article 7 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the South African Constitution. You look at Section 4, actually, of the South African Prevention on Combating Torture of Persons Act, which was actually enacted in 2013, that says that no person may be subjected to torture on inhuman or degrading treatment. And so the third would then be the right to equal protection and non-discrimination, where Section 9(1) of the South African Constitution emphasized the right to equality before the law, says that, you know, at no point should I assume that because a person owes me, or because the person steals a cell phone or whatever narrative, I automatically am above the person and I must beat the person. Because I mean, these guys were, I don't know if some of you watched the video, but it's something that, I mean, it should not even be in the scene. Some of them were like, I don't know, dog tied or something like that, hands and legs, like pigs that were about to be bride or something. It's really, you know, it's really horrible. And sometimes people bring in a xenophobic trend to say, oh, it is South African and the Nigerian context, or the South African and the Lebanese, or the South African and the DRC, because one of the suspects that actually was apprehended is a Congolese person. And some say, oh, that's why, you know, Congolese must go back to their country, or Lebanese must go back to their country, or Nigerians must go back to their countries because they continue to perpetuate such crimes. But I think it's a much deeper, you know, issue than just nationality or whatever is being perpetuated. But I think another thing is that, just to tie into the mental health, is that this victim has, yes, they've suffered physical harm, but they've also suffered emotional harm and reputational damage, where some of them are still in high school or some of them work. Like, how do they face their colleagues? This thing is all over, you know, it's all over the internet. It's all over the place, where how are they able? It's something that I think they would have to deal with for the rest of their life. I don't know what would beat that. But again, I think that's why the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, an institution I work for, we are open to actually always provide this mental health and psychosocial support to these victims. So if anyone knows some of these victims, please feel free to actually refer them to us so that we can actually provide that support to them. Because I think there could be the fear that maybe some of them could actually even take their own lives because of the shame. And how do they face their family? How do they face if they're in a relationship? How do they face their girlfriends or their wives? How do they face their, you know, so this goes beyond the immediate physical harm, because again, it also undermines public trust when it comes to, for people going to clubs. So for some people who decide, oh, you know, it's a Friday, I want to go to the club to chill, or it's a Saturday. Now, how do you gain trust in those places when you don't even know if you're next, right? And also, how do I have a trust in security personnel when I'm not sure if I'm next, right? So again, there's also that fear where it also discourages people from, you know, accessing public spaces, because yes, it's the club today, but what about if it's a restaurant tomorrow, if it's not already happening? So again, like I said, these things could have a very long-term psychological effect, where the wider society suffers, because that's one of the reasons why we're having these webinars now, because imagine it happening just right adjacent to the university, which is a place that is meant to be a safe haven for students who've come from all over to be there. And so again, I would say that this is something that needs to be addressed, because the question is, if it's not addressed, what message are we sending to others? Does it mean that tomorrow even I can beat up a person, I can torture a person, and it's okay because I can go scot-free, maybe because I have, you know, I can maybe bribe, I don't know what it is, but these people will need to be brought to book, because how many people will continue to feel unsafe, the humiliation, how acceptable is this, right? So I do know that some reforms have been going on. Like I think the licenses of Zanzou has been revoked. I think the South African License Board or something, I think it's the Alcohol Board or something, they kind of revoked the license, but I think that more needs to be done. So I would say, for example, there needs to be a better regulation or oversight of private security because of the ILO Convention number 190 that talks about the importance of actually creating safe spaces for all people, whether it's at work, whether it's at public events or recreational spaces. And then there needs to be accountability for businesses, right? So it also says, like Principle 13 of the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights actually states that businesses, including nightclubs, have a responsibility to respect human rights. And so entertainment venues must implement policies that actually prevent abuses, ensuring that staff or patron, in this case, understand the consequences of actually violating people's rights, right? And then the responsibility to respect human rights requires that business enterprises must avoid causing or contributing to adverse human rights impacts through their own activities, which they've done in this case, and also to address such impacts when they occur, seek to prevent or mitigate adverse human rights impacts that are directly linked to their operations, products, or services by their business relationship, even if they had not contributed to this impact. Because I know that the Zanzou Club had put out a statement, which for me, it was very bogus, to say, oh, no, we're not part of it, we're not whatever. But you have the duty of care, right? To actually ensure that whether you've directly contributed or not, you have that duty of care to ensure that you are able to kind of prevent or mitigate adverse human rights impacts like what has happened. And obviously, there's so many laws that I've mentioned that the DDG had mentioned, other people have mentioned, but the question is the implementation. So it's one thing to have these beautiful laws printed in papers, the Bill of Rights, the South African Constitution, which has, the South African Constitution and the Bill of Rights is one of the most in-depth in the world, or in Africa, if I would say, in terms of, they having a separate Bill of Rights. But when it comes to implementation, what happens? And so I think to conclude, I would like to say that answer the question, where do we go from here? Or what do we do next? As just having this webinar where we just talk and probably go, is that we need to come together to ensure that we're able to hold perpetrators accountable. And, whether it means supporting legal action. So, I think that all of these institutions gathered here today can actually, start up a legal action against those responsible for the violence and the abuse. We can advocate for better policies, which I know the Center of Human Rights, they do it amazingly well, to continue to advocate for better policies that actually governs all of this, like the nightlife industries, the security firms and all of that. I already said that the CSVR, we're ready to support victims to ensure that they are able to mentally, support them mentally to be able to find themselves back into whether their workspace, whether their schools, however, to let them know that, we are with them and we completely, support them. So I would say that, the Zanzou nightclub incident is something that should never have happened in the first place. But now it is. And now that it has happened, I think what we can do is ensure that it doesn't happen again. And upholding all of this rights is not a government or a Center for Human Rights obligation, or the South African Human Rights Commission's obligation. I would say that it's all of us is our responsibility to share, where even the person who was recording, the person was complicit because they could have done something about it. They could have reported immediately to the police. But I think it's something that of a relationship went sour. It's been happening. They've been covering it, and then maybe one of the staff members was not happy with the way the staff members treated them or something, and they decided to whistleblow in a way. So why do we have to wait until such happens? The fact that you're already doing all of this, you're already complicit. So it's not dependent on the institutions or organizations. It's dependent on all of us to ensure that we demand justice and we refuse to remain silent, and we can actually work together to actually create safer environments that would move us towards a just and equitable society. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mary, for highlighting the importance of the psyche of the victims, because we take it for granted that it's like circulating on social media. Yes, a crime was reported, but what about the individuals who are in those videos? They are going to suffer a lot, and for them to come back into the society and mix with everybody else is going to be difficult for them. And I think your organization is doing a good job in raising awareness that they can reach out to you and get the assistance that they need. The next speaker is going to be Ms. Tabile Kuya.
Hi, good morning, and thank you so much for the opportunity to actually come on here and engage. I echo the sentiments of all the speakers that have spoken so far. And I'd just like to start off by piggybacking on what Mary had just said, which is the fact that I think this should be a wake-up call for our country, a moment for us to take a step back. Because as Mary said, we have one of the most progressive constitutions and Bill of Rights in the world that affords citizens such far-reaching and extensive rights and protections. But there is a disconnect in what we do on paper and what is the lived experience of the everyday man. And I think many of us have heard this saying that you should not treat a symptom, but you should go and look for the cause, because when you try to treat symptoms and you don't actually attack the root cause of something, you will never actually eradicate a problem. So for me, what I would like to do, I would like to zero in on SAPS, because what has come out actually by this alleged whistleblower is that, in fact, SAPS has been knowing about many of these gross human rights violations, allegedly the SAPS in Sunnyside in Pretoria, and they have been complicit because they have been paid off to cover up these crimes. And we have a lot of instruments and bodies set up in place to address acts of corruption like this. We have the Prevention of Corrupt Activities Act, Section 32 specifically, that actually holds people in positions of authority that do not report crimes in exchange for gratification accountable. We also have the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, IPID, that are meant to actually investigate corrupt activities committed by police officials. But I think for me, the biggest, or one of the biggest questions that I found myself having is, how in the world can such acts even take place under the watch of SAPS? And I think for me, what, I took a step back and had to ask myself that why, because this allegation of SAPS being corrupt is not a new one. Everybody knows that, police officials allegedly always can be easily bribed. So I think from a government point of view, it could be a point in time to actually look into why are SAPS officials very susceptible to being bribed and to receiving corrupt bribery gifts. Do we actually need to take a step back and look at how can we protect the impartiality of SAPS in them actually fulfilling their duties? Do we need to look at maybe giving them better compensation in the same way that the judiciary, there's a lot of mechanisms in place to protect the impartiality of the judiciary. Even with the NPA, they operate with no fear, no favor. And there's a lot of mechanisms in place to ensure that they're able to do their job and protect them as much as possible from being susceptible to being bribed and being corrupt and covering up such crimes. So I think, as much as, like Mary had also said, everybody has a part to play, citizens, but the bodies that are the first point of call, which is SAPS, in defending the Bill of Rights and defending violations of the Bill of Rights, they need to be strengthened. They need to be looked into, need to be investigated as to why is SAPS so complicit and easy to turn a blind eye for in the face of such gross violations. And I also just wanted to touch on, what the role is of the individual citizen. So we do know that these allegations came to light because of this individual called Pablo. And I too hold the view that there was a responsibility on him, because he says that he has over 70 other videos. And we also know that these particular incidents took place in 2022. So all that time, was he the one recording these human rights violations, this torture? And if so, why now does he come forward? Is it because allegedly he was trying to extort the business for money? And because he didn't receive that payment, he decided to come forward. So I think for me also, where we find individuals where you see a complete, like, this is just what everybody has said, it's completely heartbreaking. And there should be a responsibility that, as citizens, not only are we supposed to protect our own human rights, but when we see other human rights violations taking place, that we take action. And where such action doesn't happen, that the NPA should also start opening cases of obstructing the ends of justice, because this is key evidence, material evidence, that was held onto for what I feel are questionable motives. So we also have to say that, as different stakeholders in society, individuals, different departments like SAPS, everybody needs to play their role. But my just, closing remarks is that I really do hope that the government will look into SAPS as a department, look into the culture of SAPS and why there's this culture of them being so susceptible to bribery, because they are the first point of call in defending our Constitution and defending our Bill of Rights. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stabile. Our last speaker is going to be Ayanda.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I also acknowledge the previous speakers, and much of what I'm going to say is interconnected with what has been said. So I think I will begin by stating the obvious, the fact that this is a critical and deeply unsettling issue. And the horrific violations at Zanzou nightclub are not just an isolated acts of brutality. They're actually symptoms of something far more insidious. And that is a society grappling with the weight of its own unhealed wounds. Therefore, we cannot look at this incident in isolation. I think it is important that we ask ourselves what kind of environment allows this level of violence to unfold so brazenly? What does it say about power, about impunity, about the very fabric of our justice system? So when we witness acts of torture, sexual violence, and inhumane treatment, not in the shadows, but in full public view, recorded, circulated, and almost normalized, we must confront the uncomfortable truth, which in my opinion is the fact that South Africa is a country still deeply haunted by a past that it has not fully reckoned with. We are a nation born from violence, and the scars of our history, of apartheid, of a colonial rule, of systemic dehumanization, are not relics of the past. They are active forces that shape our present. They live in our institutions, in our policing, in our responses to justice, in the nightclub industry, and in the way certain bodies, especially Black bodies, women's bodies, working class bodies, are still seen as expandable. So the Zanzou incident demands more than outrage. It demands that we ask, how did we get here? And how does violence remain embedded in the everyday? And why do we still see brutality as a means of control? What happens when power remains unchecked? I believe that addressing these questions is not just about holding individuals accountable, though that is essential. It is very essential. But it is also about dismantling the systems that allow such violations to happen in the first place. I believe that we're a country that is in desperate need of healing, yet we continue to look away from the wounds that demand our attention. If we don't address the roots of our brokenness, if we do not interrogate the culture of violence, the failures of justice, and the normalization of suffering, then Zanzou will not be an exception. Instead, it will be a pattern. It will be a cycle that repeats itself over and over again. Because until we address the deeper systemic issues, until we commit to the work of true justice, accountability, and transformation, we will continue to bear witness to the violence of a nation that has yet to heal. Now, this brings me to the question of how. So how do we move forward? I think this is one of the most critical questions, because acknowledging a problem without action only allows it to persist. The truth is, if we don't, as a country, we don't really need new laws or policies to tell us that what happened in Zanzou was a violation of fundamental human rights. Our constitution, the very foundation of our democracy, already makes it clear. For example, Section 12 of the Constitution states that everyone has the right not to be tortured in any way. And Section 10 affirms that everyone has inherent dignity and the right to have their dignity respected and protected. These are not just suggestions. These are binding legal and moral obligations. And yet we live in a country where these rights are routinely ignored, especially when it comes to those with the least power. So what must be done? I think the first thing is, obviously, my peers have mentioned this, is to hold the nightclub industry accountable. I think we've focused on the nightclub security personnel, and rightfully so. But what about the nightclub owners? What about those who profit from these spaces while turning a blind eye to the abuses happening within their walls? The nightclub industry, like any other, must be held to a standard of safety and human dignity. And there must be clear regulations that require mandatory security training that focuses on de-escalation and not just brutality. Strict monitoring and compliance checks to ensure that clubs are meeting safety standards, as well as legal consequences for club owners who allow violence to thrive under their watch. If your establishment becomes a site of torture and human rights violations, you should not be operating. And if your security staff engage in criminal acts, you should be held liable too as a club owner. The second point is around making consequences unavoidable. We have seen time and time again that when there are no consequences, impunity thrives. Every individual that is responsible for what happened at Zanzou, every person who tortured, assaulted, or enabled these crimes in any way must be held accountable in the fullest extent of the law. This is not just about firing security guards, bouncers, or whoever. This is about criminal persecution, and people must go to jail for this. But it cannot stop with Zanzou. We need to set a precedent that any establishment that violates the dignity and safety of its customers will face legal action. This must be a turning point and not just a moment of outrage. The third point is around we need to expand the conversation beyond Zanzou. I'm reminded of how the Spaza shop incident forced us to scrutinize well-established retail stores. We assumed that the problem only existed in informal businesses, but when we looked closer, we found that the major chains were also failing to meet basic operational standards. The same must happen here. If Zanzou was exposed, how many clubs are operating in the same way? How many venues across South Africa are spaces of unchecked violence? So we do need an industry-wide investigation into how nightclubs operate, how many security personnel are trained, and how the safety of customers, particularly women and marginalized groups, is prioritized. The last recommendation is around shifting the culture of violence. I've spoken about holding the nightclub industry accountable, making consequences unavoidable, and expanding the conversation beyond Zanzou. I also think it is important to shift the culture of violence. At its core, this is not just about one club. It's about a culture of violence in South Africa that continues to thrive because we don't disrupt it at its roots. Whether it is in our homes, on the streets, in our workplaces, in the nightclubs, violence is still seen as an acceptable way to assert power. So we must actively dismantle this culture through stronger enforcement of human rights protections, public accountability and activism. We cannot normalize brutality, as well as a commitment to breaking cycles of trauma and impunity. For me, justice is not just about what we punish, it is also about what we refuse to tolerate. If we're serious about making sure this does not happen again, then we must be serious about enforcing the laws we already have, demanding accountability from those in power, and ensuring that every South African, no matter where they are, has their dignity and safety respected. Because anything less than that means that we'll find ourselves here again. And I think that is something that we cannot afford. So Belinda, I'm going to stop here. I had other points about the psyche of the perpetrator, but I'm going to stop here and pass the mic back to you.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to pass the mic to my colleague, Ms. Tendai.
Thank you. You need to mute yours. Yes. Thank you, Belinda. And thank you, everyone, for such sound submissions. I think as students and people who are based at the University of Pretoria, Zanzou nightclub is something that we see every day. And you cannot avoid thinking about what we have seen whenever we pass through the Jan Shoba Street. And I'd like to open the floor for some quick engagements. Are there any questions? Are there any additions? I would like to hear the participants, if you have any reactions before I hand over to the participants, perhaps to the presenters to perhaps say the closing remarks. Maybe to our guests who have been listening, do you have any reactions to what we have seen and what we've been hearing? That's could be the first thing that I would like to ask. You could raise your hand and then we could attend to the hand. Anyone who would like to react to the presentations? Okay, Mfudzi, come in. Could you share your reaction? You can mute yourself. Please go ahead. Mufudzi, I think you need to unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, please. Not so sure what's going on with Mufudzi. All right. Let me see if I can unmute you, but I don't think I'm able. They're saying there are technical issues. Okay, thank you. I'll leave a comment in the chat. Okay, that's fine. And who would like to react? Is there anyone with comment, reaction? It seems we don't have reactions. All right, maybe I take it back to our presenters for final remarks before I then explain what would be the way forward from this. Maybe I'll start.
There were
Okay.
comments in the chat. I'm not sure if you've seen those.
The comments. Okay, you'd like to read the comments in the chat? I'm seeing two chats. There's one that I'm chatting with the administrator. I'm not seeing the one.
Yeah, there is.
From Unread.
Yeah.
Our subs were never supposed to be changed to a service. They had to remain a force that delivers a very specific service to society, a force that can still be aligned with the ideas of our constitution, but still, even as a service, they can still do the same. I think it's a matter of the organizational renewal, or the organization has to undergo through some cleansing. I think it has been getting corrupt over time. The naming of subs itself, personally, I don't think it's a challenge. I think the challenge is the conduct of subs. I think that more needs to be done to address such rogue elements. Is there anyone who would like to react? All right, maybe we go back to Andre, do you want to come in and share your view? Andre? Okay. All right. All right, let's go back to our panelists. Mary, do you have some final remarks?
Yes, I do. I want to say that I would like us to keep the momentum going, because one thing that I know is we love hashtags. We go on Twitter, hashtag, Zanzou nightclub, hashtag whatever. But I would say that, we just don't end with this conversation. I would say that we continue to push for the change. Why? Because, aside the fact that, the Zanzou incident was never supposed to happen, I don't think that it was just an isolated incident of just one night gone wrong, right? I think it represents a failure to uphold the basic human rights that we all deserve. And so it's important that we all know that collectively we must hold the perpetrators accountable and ensure that we prevent such in the future. So I would say that I would like us to continue the conversation, offline, online, however, about creating that safe space where everyone's right is respected. So I think for me, I'm open, and I'm actually I'm looking forward to actually hearing the way forward, Tendai, because I think when you said you want to talk about the way forward, I think for me it was like a big nod to say, okay, this is not just one of those conversations where we just talk and go, but I'm actually looking forward to the way forward, so I can also see how individually and also as the representative of an organization, to see how we can work together with the Center for Human Rights to make sure that this is not just all talk, but it's also backed by action. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lwazi, would you like to say some closing remarks?
Yes, thank you so much, Tendai, and thank you for the Center for Human Rights for inviting us today for this contribution, this discussion. Fundamentally, for me, the situation of Zanzou is a microcosm of a broader society and what is happening within South African society. One that is met out with a lack of appreciation of the legal framework that is underpinned by our constitution, but secondly, the factor of lack of accountability, especially by private sector actors. This behavior by these security guards is a continuation of normalized behavior by that particular club industry. And there needs to be some form of accountability, including accountability towards private sectors, the bosses and the owners of such businesses. This also includes around migration hiring, around issues around exploitation of workers, issues around lack of pay of workers, etc., etc. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed a lot of cleavages concerning business relationships with the institutional framework, especially concerning the UIF and businesses' payments into the UIF that had lived experiences of people being employed. On this instance, we see businesses conducting human rights atrocities, and we need to find a way and means to holding them accountable as envisioned within our constitution and legal framework. So going forward, the issue around public conscientization and public education and public literacy around the constitution itself might be very important, but it's insufficient, as we need to also change social attitudes going forward. And that also starts with conversations within your family and people passing on a more positive masculinity and understanding one's constitutional rights. And that will be the bedrock for our engagement going forward. And we hope the national government, through the national dialogue process, conducts a broader framework to engage and deal with these social pressures that is inclusive of what we have in mind, of what the Constitution itself has in mind. And therefore, thank you for the Center for Human Rights for inviting us to this discussion and for us to continue unpacking such relevant issue and topics and for engaging on these very important issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lwazi. Deeply appreciated. Stabile, come in.
Thank you again to the Center for inviting me and inviting all the other speakers. I also want to thank the other speakers for their submissions. And I think just in closing, I just want to say that this incident is a symptom of a very ill society. We know that we have very beautiful, lovely rights on paper, but there is a clear disjuncture where these rights, these protections are not being felt by the lived experience of the everyday man. We also know that a very key component in enforcing and in protecting our human rights is SAPS as a department, and that there's a rot that runs very deep within SAPS, and that needs to be interrogated thoroughly. We need to ask ourselves, why is it that these types of crimes can go rampant when we have a body like SAPS that is responsible for actually enforcing and defending our constitution? So is it a matter of they need to look at ways of insulating SAPS better to protect their impartiality, to allow them to do their job? And in doing so, that will act as a deterrent to other people who might want to actually commit such heinous acts and crimes. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stabile, for your sound submissions. I would like to invite Ayanda I understand some of the speakers could have left, but I think nonetheless, the conversation is something that is very satisfying. So I can come through with your closing remarks. I know you had a point that you also wanted to elaborate. If you can just touch it briefly, then you then say your remarks, then I will then come in with the way forward.
I echo what my speakers have also said. Thank you so much to the Center for inviting us. I learned quite a lot from the speakers as well. I think the last thing that I'll say is that I think it's important that we confront not just the physical acts of violence, but also the mindset that allows it to happen without remorse. So when we look at the perpetrators of the Zanzou incident, we must understand that they are not just acting out of isolated rage. They are products of a society that has taught them that violence is a legitimate response to power dynamics. So the psyche of a perpetrator is shaped by a system that dehumanizes certain bodies. It's a psyche that sees the victim not as a person with inherent dignity, but as an object that is to be controlled, manipulated, and broken. And this mindset doesn't emerge overnight. It is the result of systemic trauma, learned behaviors, as well as unchecked privilege. So the perpetrators are not just monsters in our midst. They are the mirrors of the violence that we've tolerated for far too long. So if we're to heal as a nation, we must recognize that the perpetrators are part of this broken system and culture of violence. And until we address this cycle, this conditioning, we will never break free from the endless repetition of violence. And this is why accountability must go beyond punishment. It must include confronting as well as dismantling the structures that create these violent psyches in the first place. So I guess my final call to action is that this is not just a fight for justice for the victims of Zanzou. I think it's a fight for the soul of our society that we love so much. And if we're to truly heal, we must rebuild our institutions, our communities, and the very way we see each other. That's important. And it's time to stop tolerating violence in any form, to stop allowing it to be normalized, and to demand that every South African's humanity is respected. I say, let's not allow the victim's pain to be in vain. Instead, let it spark a revolution of compassion, of accountability, as well as change. I thank you.
Thank you, Ayanda. I think there is a consensus that the Zanzou incident is a tip of the iceberg of many violations that are happening daily in these spaces. There's also a consensus that there's more to this. If we saw men, and there's gender experts are questioning what could have been violations for other genders that we are yet to know. So as a way forward, as the Center for Human Rights and stakeholders that we have engaged yourselves, we are committed to keep on the conversation going. We're going to write a detailed report, which will include all your contributions and your names and that you've participated, you've contributed to this conversation, and we'll also share with you for some kind of looking at it before we put it online. And then that's the first step. And the second step, I think we need to engage in combined advocacy so that we keep on talking about the issue. I think the strategies will come out of the report. I think we have actionable points that we can jointly then sit down and set from all the actions that we've put in this combined short report or short statement, say, what can we need to do? Then we have action programs designed for advocacy designed from there. And then we'll also engage Center for Human Rights authorities to see if we can have a special issue to write about this, because it's an area that has not been explored, and it's an area that deserves our voices to be projected in the space so that we become the voices of reason, we articulate the frameworks, mitigation strategies, among others. So be also on the aware of that there's something that we would like to do, and your participation in that, in a special issue, some form of application could be something that is good, so that we then use those as resources for future interventions and advocacy. That ends the webinar. And thank you so much at a short notice for availing yourself to participate in this important conversation. And we deeply appreciate your contribution. And until next time, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.